But across that narrow stretch of water, something was happening that had no precedent in military history. Marine Sergeant Frank Few stared into the jungle darkness, his half-Cherokee heritage singing through his blood with ancestral hunting instincts the Japanese couldn't possibly understand. Next to him in the foxhole, Private Sid Phillips fed another ammunition belt into his machine gun with the methodical precision of a farm boy who'd spent his entire life fixing machinery that absolutely refused to quit working. Few whispered to his foxhole partner. "You hearing that?" The jungle had gone completely silent. Even the endless insect chorus that usually filled the tropical nights had stopped. These weren't the weekend warriors Ichiki imagined cowering in their positions. Phillips had survived the Great Depression, had watched his entire family lose everything they owned, had learned young that sometimes you fought dirty or you simply didn't eat. Few had grown up hunting in the Arizona mountains, where a single mistake meant death, where patience and cunning mattered infinitely more than raw courage. They weren't fighting for emperor worship or ancestral honor or any of those abstract concepts. They were fighting to go home alive, and they were about to introduce the Japanese army to a type of warfare that existed nowhere in their military doctrine. Colonel Ichiki rose to his feet, his hand moving unconsciously to his sword hilt in a gesture older than his grandfather's grandfather. Around him in the darkness, 900 men prepared for what they believed would be the last banzai charge of a very short battle. They'd practiced this exact moment 1,000 times in training. The swift river crossing, the coordinated assault, the terrified American retreat. But nobody had bothered to tell them that Marine Corps doctrine didn't actually include retreating from defensive positions. Ichiki addressed his battalion commanders in whispers barely audible above the jungle sounds. "Listen carefully. The American Marines lack discipline. They're individualists who cannot grasp the spiritual strength of Japanese soldiers. When we charge with fixed bayonets, screaming the Emperor's name, their Western minds will shatter. They'll run like frightened rabbits." His intelligence reports confirmed everything he believed. These Americans came from a soft democracy where every man thought he was special, where collective sacrifice was impossible to achieve. How could such men possibly stand against soldiers raised on 2,000 years of samurai tradition? But across the water, machine gunner Art Pendleton was testing his weapon's traverse for perhaps the 100th time that night, calculating fields of fire with the cold precision of a Massachusetts factory worker who understood that machines either functioned perfectly or people died. His ammunition loader, Whitney Jacobs, arranged the belts with obsessive care, because growing up poor in Depression-era America had taught him that wasting anything, even bullets, could get you killed in the end. These Marines weren't thinking about emperors or democracy or grand ideological struggles. They were thinking about the Japanese soldier who'd used a white flag last week to lure Colonel Goetge's patrol into an ambush, then beheaded the survivors and mutilated their bodies as a message. They were thinking about Pearl Harbor, about friends who'd died in the Philippines, about a war they'd never wanted but now intended to finish on their own terms. And they'd spent weeks transforming this river crossing into a killing ground designed by men whose only philosophy was winning. The Japanese military mind couldn't comprehend what awaited them. Their Bushido code demanded honor in battle, face-to-face combat where courage and spirit determined victory. But these Americans had no Bushido code at all. They had something far more dangerous instead. The desperate ingenuity of men who absolutely refused to lose, who would use any method, any tactic, any weapon to ensure they walked away alive. Hidden mortars had been pre-sighted on the riverbank days ago. Machine guns were positioned in interlocking fields of fire that would turn the shallow water red. Flares waited to illuminate the killing ground like a night baseball game. Even the barbed wire had been strung not to stop the Japanese advance, but to channel it into prepared killing zones where American weapons could achieve maximum efficiency. Private Jim Young adjusted his mortar sight one final time, remembering what his father had told him about hunting white-tailed deer back in Ohio. "Sometimes the deer thinks he's hunting you, son. That's when you discover who's really the predator and who's really the prey." At 2:50 in the morning, Colonel Ichiki gave the signal. 900 Japanese soldiers rose as one entity, their bayonets catching faint starlight, their voices joining together in a war cry that had echoed across Asia for centuries. They surged toward the river with absolute confidence, certain that American nerve would shatter at the very sound of Japanese steel coming for them. They had no conception they were about to encounter something their entire military philosophy had never imagined. Americans who fought like the jungle itself, patient, brutal, utterly without mercy or hesitation. The first Japanese soldiers splashed into the Tenaru River, and for just a single moment, the night seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Then hell opened its mouth and swallowed them whole. Whitney Jacobs fired the first shot at exactly 2:51 in the morning, the muzzle flash shattering the tropical night like breaking glass. In that single moment, 2,000 years of Japanese military tradition collided head-on with American industrial firepower, and the collision destroyed everything Colonel Ichiki thought he understood about warfare. The Japanese war cry split the darkness as hundreds of elite soldiers plunged into the river, bayonets gleaming like silver lightning in the darkness. They expected American panic, American retreat, American surrender. Instead, they got something that existed nowhere in their military manuals or tactical doctrine. They got Marines who fought like the jungle had taught them to fight. Art Pendleton's machine gun erupted first, its muzzle flash painting the riverbank in strobing orange light that turned night into a series of frozen snapshots. Japanese soldiers, magnificent in their courage, perfect in their formation, charged directly into interlocking fields of fire that transformed the shallow water into an industrial slaughterhouse. Pendleton screamed over the deafening roar of his weapon. Jesus Christ, they just keep coming, wave after wave. But these weren't the scattered individual attacks that Japanese doctrine expected from American individualists. This was coordinated violence on a scale that made Bushido completely irrelevant. Every Marine weapon fired into predetermined killing zones that had been plotted on maps days earlier. Mortar shells, pre-sighted with mathematical precision, began falling with the reliability of factory machinery. Flares burst overhead, turning night into blazing artificial day and silhouetting Japanese soldiers like targets in some nightmare shooting gallery. Colonel Ichiki watched in growing horror as his perfectly trained, perfectly disciplined soldiers were slaughtered not by American courage or American fighting spirit, but by American engineering. This wasn't honorable combat between warriors. This was industrial killing on an assembly line, and his men were the raw material being processed into corpses. Private First Class Jim Young dropped mortar shells down the tube as fast as his loader could hand them up, each explosion sending geysers of mud and water and human flesh into the air. "We're not fighting soldiers anymore," someone shouted. "We're exterminating insects." The Japanese kept coming forward because Bushido demanded it. Retreat meant dishonor worse than death itself. But every step forward carried them deeper into a killing machine designed by men who'd learned warfare in the factories and farms of America, men who understood that efficiency mattered infinitely more than honor or glory or any abstract concept. Sergeant Frank Few, his Cherokee blood singing with predatory instincts, moved through the jungle like a ghost made flesh. When Japanese soldiers managed to break through the river crossing, they didn't find retreating Americans. They found individual Marines who hunted them in the darkness, using techniques older than civilization itself. Few's knife found 3 Japanese throats before they even knew death was among them in the shadows. Lieutenant Furukawa, clutching at a sucking chest wound, watched his company disintegrate around him. "This isn't war," he gasped to nobody in particular. "This is butchery." And he was absolutely right. This was exactly what it was. The Americans fought without honor, without rules, without mercy of any kind. They used shotguns, weapons so brutal the Geneva Convention would later try to ban them as too inhumane for civilized warfare. They coordinated mortar fire like factory foremen coordinating assembly lines in Detroit. They fought at night from concealment, bringing industrial violence against men trained for honorable combat. and it was devastatingly, horrifyingly effective. Colonel Ichiki, his perfect uniform now stained with mud and blood and the reality of modern warfare, realized with crystalline horror that everything his military education had taught him was fundamentally wrong. These Americans weren't fighting like soldiers at all. They were fighting like a machine, a killing machine that fed on Japanese courage and excreted Japanese corpses with mechanical efficiency. Private Al Schmid, his face half destroyed by grenade fragments, continued firing his machine gun even though he'd been completely blinded. His loader shouted directions directly into his ear. Left, more left, now fire. The gun chattered endlessly, cutting down Japanese soldiers who died with perfect honor and perfect futility. Corporal Johnny Rivers screamed that they were in the wire. Japanese soldiers tangled themselves in barbed wire that channeled them directly into his gun's kill zone, like cattle into a slaughterhouse chute. His machine gun fired until the barrel glowed cherry red, until the water jacket boiled away, until the weapon itself began to melt from sustained fire. This was the moment when Japanese military philosophy met American industrial capacity head-on, and philosophy lost completely. The Japanese soldiers fought magnificently. Nobody could question their courage. They charged into machine gun fire without flinching or hesitating. They leaped over the bodies of their fallen comrades and charged again. They screamed the Emperor's name as bullets tore them apart. Their courage was absolute, their discipline perfect, their honor beyond question. And it meant absolutely nothing at all. Because the Americans weren't fighting for honor or glory. They were fighting to win. And winning meant killing every Japanese soldier in the most efficient way possible, using whatever methods achieved that goal. Sid Phillips watched through his mortar sight as Japanese soldiers, boys his own age from farms and cities thousands of miles away, were blown apart by American explosives. He felt no honor, no glory, no satisfaction in the killing. Just the grim determination of a farm boy who understood that sometimes you had to kill what was trying to kill you, and you did it as efficiently as possible. The river ran red with blood, Japanese bodies piled 3 and 4 deep in the shallow water. The sound of American weapons never stopped. Machine guns, mortars, rifles, shotguns, all firing in a coordinated symphony of destruction that transformed elite Japanese soldiers into scattered meat and bone. At 4:17 in the morning, Colonel Ichiki committed seppuku in the jungle. He didn't die in glorious combat with an American bayonet in his hands. He didn't fall leading a final charge against the enemy position. He died alone among the trees, disemboweling himself with his ancestral sword because he couldn't face the truth. The truth that American tactical efficiency had just destroyed the finest soldiers Japan could produce. His suicide note, discovered days later by American patrols, contained a single line of Japanese characters. We did not understand what we were fighting. By dawn, 890 Japanese soldiers lay dead along a 100-yard stretch of riverbank. The Marines lost 43 men. The mathematical brutality of that casualty ratio told the entire story more clearly than any after-action report ever could. This wasn't warfare as the Japanese understood it. This wasn't even warfare as anyone understood it. This was extermination carried out with industrial efficiency. Sergeant Few walked among the Japanese bodies as morning light filtered through the jungle canopy overhead. Many of the dead soldiers looked younger than he was. Their uniforms were neat, their equipment perfect, their weapons clean and well maintained. They died like heroes from a different century, killed by men from the next one. Sid Phillips stared down at a Japanese soldier who couldn't possibly be more than 17 years old, his hand still clutching a photograph of what had to be his family back home. The boy's eyes stared at nothing, and Phillips realized with sick certainty that this was what modern warfare actually looked like. Not honor and glory, but efficient slaughter on an industrial scale. Art Pendleton whispered to nobody in particular as he surveyed the carnage his machine gun had created. God help us! What have we become? The answer hung in the humid morning air, unspoken but understood by every Marine who'd survived the night. They'd become exactly what they needed to become to survive. Not heroes, not warriors, not soldiers fighting for noble causes and abstract ideals. They'd become killers, efficient, remorseless, utterly effective killers. And in the jungle hell of Guadalcanal, that was the only thing that actually mattered. The photographs taken afterward told the story better than any military report ever could. Japanese bodies stacked like cordwood along the Tenaru River. American Marines standing among the carnage, not celebrating, not smiling, just staring with the hollow eyes of men who'd discovered something terrible about themselves and about what they were capable of doing. The mathematical precision of modern slaughter laid bare in black and white photographs that would haunt veterans for the rest of their lives. Frank Pomeroy, who survived the battle, carried one image for the rest of his life. A Japanese officer's sword still clutched in its owner's death grip, the blade reflecting the morning sun like an accusation against everyone involved. He wrote to his sister back in Massachusetts a few weeks later. "We fought like animals. And the worst part is, it worked." That letter captured the psychological transformation that Guadalcanal forced on American fighting men. They'd entered the jungle as civilized soldiers following rules of honorable combat. They'd emerged as something else entirely. Men who understood that winning mattered more than honor. That survival trumped glory every single time. That efficient killing beat courageous dying in every practical measure. The Japanese military machine, built on 2,000 years of samurai tradition, never fully recovered from that realization. Within weeks, intelligence reports from other Pacific battles began reflecting a new reality on the ground. Japanese soldiers who charged American positions with suicidal courage since Pearl Harbor now hesitated before attacking. They dug deeper foxholes. They fought more defensively. The terrifying confidence that had carried them across Asia began to crack and crumble. Because word spread quickly through any army, even one as disciplined as Japan's. The Americans weren't fighting like civilized soldiers anymore. They were fighting like the jungle itself. Patient, brutal, utterly without mercy or hesitation. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, who commanded Marines at what became known as Bloody Ridge, received a letter from a captured Japanese officer that perfectly summarized the psychological impact of American jungle tactics. "Your soldiers fight without honor," the letter read, "but they fight to win. We can no longer count on your weakness or your adherence to civilized warfare." That single sentence represented one of the most important strategic shifts in military history. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese commanders had to plan for American competence instead of American cowardice. They had to assume Marines would fight to the last man instead of surrendering. They had to account for American tactical efficiency instead of dismissing them as soft civilians playing at war. The ripple effects spread across the entire Pacific theater. At Tarawa, Japanese defenders expected banzai charges to break American resolve. Instead, they encountered Marines who'd learned the lessons of Guadalcanal, who fought with cold efficiency and showed no mercy. At Saipan, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, the pattern repeated itself. Japanese courage and honor running headlong into American industrial violence and tactical efficiency. The outcome was never really in doubt after Guadalcanal showed which approach would prevail. Marine Sergeant Sid Phillips, interviewed 50 years after the battle, put it simply. "We went to Guadalcanal as boys playing soldier. We came back as men who knew how to kill efficiently and without hesitation. The Japanese never expected that transformation, and it cost them the war in the Pacific. But the cost extended far beyond military strategy and tactical doctrine. The Marines who fought at Guadalcanal returned home carrying something dark and permanent in their souls. They'd discovered that civilized men could become savage killers when survival demanded it. They'd learned that courage without competence was just suicide by another name. That honor without victory was just death with better poetry. Most disturbing of all, they'd learned they were very, very good at killing other human beings when they stopped thinking of them as human beings and started thinking of them as targets to be eliminated. Art Pendleton, whose machine gun had cut down hundreds of Japanese soldiers in a single night, never spoke about the battle to his children or grandchildren. When asked about his war service, he would only say that they'd done what they had to do. His grandson found his war diary after Pendleton's death in 1987. The final entry, dated August 22, 1942, contained just 4 words written in shaking handwriting. God forgive us all. Today, military historians study Guadalcanal as the crucial moment when American forces learned to match Japanese ferocity with industrial efficiency. They analyze the tactics, the weapons, the terrain, the leadership decisions. But the real lesson runs deeper than tactics or strategy or any of those measurable factors. Guadalcanal proved that civilization is a thin veneer, easily stripped away when survival is genuinely at stake. It demonstrated that ordinary men, farmers and factory workers and store clerks could become extraordinarily effective killers when properly motivated and properly trained. The Japanese soldiers who died at the Tenaru River were brave beyond question. They were disciplined. They were honorable. They died for emperor and country with perfect courage and perfect devotion to duty. But courage wasn't enough when your enemy had abandoned honor for efficiency, when your opponent fought not for glory but for survival, when the men across the river had decided that going home alive mattered more than any abstract concept of civilized warfare. In the end, that's the lesson written in Japanese blood along a jungle river on an obscure Pacific island most Americans had never heard of before the war. Sometimes the side that fights dirtiest is the side that goes home alive. And in 1942, going home alive was the only victory that actually mattered to the men doing the fighting. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without cost. Every Marine who survived Guadalcanal carried scars that had nothing to do with shrapnel or bullets. They'd crossed a line that civilized men aren't supposed to cross. They'd discovered they could kill efficiently and sleep afterward. That they could watch other human beings die and feel nothing except satisfaction that those dead men wouldn't be killing them. Some of them would spend the rest of their lives trying to reconcile what they'd become on Guadalcanal with who they'd been before the war. Private Jim Young returned to Ohio after the war and never touched a gun again. He'd killed so many Japanese soldiers with his mortar that he'd stopped counting after the first 100. The precise number didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that he'd become a killing machine, and machines don't feel guilt or remorse or anything except the mechanical satisfaction of functioning properly. It took him 30 years to feel like a human being again, instead of a weapon that happened to walk around on 2 legs. Sergeant Frank Few went back to Arizona and spent years hunting in the same mountains where he'd learned to track as a child. But hunting deer wasn't the same after Guadalcanal. The deer didn't shoot back. The deer didn't scream when you killed them. The deer didn't haunt your dreams with their dead eyes asking why you'd killed them so efficiently. He eventually stopped hunting altogether because it reminded him too much of that night on the river when he'd hunted Japanese soldiers through the jungle and killed them with his knife and felt absolutely nothing except professional satisfaction. Whitney Jacobs, who'd fired the first shot of the battle, never told his wife exactly what he'd done on Guadalcanal. She knew he'd been there. She knew he'd fought. But she never knew that her husband had killed the first Japanese soldier of the battle and then kept killing until his rifle barrel was too hot to touch. She never knew that sometimes he woke up in the middle of the night hearing Japanese war cries and reaching for a rifle that wasn't there anymore. She never knew that the quiet, gentle man she married had once been a very efficient killer who'd helped slaughter 890 men in a single night. The Japanese soldiers who died at the Tenaru River left families behind in Japan. Wives who would never see their husbands again. Children who would grow up without fathers. Parents who would receive official notifications that their sons had died gloriously for the emperor, never knowing that they'd actually died tangled in barbed wire or cut down by machine gun fire or blown apart by mortar shells. The Japanese government told those families their sons and husbands and fathers had died like heroes. They didn't mention that those heroes had run straight into a killing machine designed by American engineers and operated by American farm boys who'd learned to kill as efficiently as they'd once learned to harvest wheat. The battle changed Japanese tactics across the entire Pacific. After Guadalcanal, Japanese commanders stopped assuming American weakness. They stopped planning for American retreat. They started digging deeper defensive positions. They started fighting more cautiously. But the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Japanese military culture valued courage and honor and spiritual strength. American military culture valued efficiency and firepower and going home alive. When those two philosophies collided, the outcome was never really in doubt. The side that cared more about efficiency than honor would always win in the end, because dead heroes can't fight the next battle. By the time the war ended in 1945, the pattern established at Guadalcanal had repeated itself across the Pacific. At every island, at every battle, Japanese courage ran headlong into American firepower and American tactical efficiency. The casualty ratios told the same story every time. For every American killed, multiple Japanese soldiers died. Not because Americans were braver or more skilled or more devoted to their cause, but because Americans had learned to fight like machines instead of warriors. Because Americans had discovered that modern warfare rewarded efficiency over honor, that industrial killing beat individual courage every single time. The nuclear bombs that finally ended the war in the Pacific were just the logical conclusion of what started at Guadalcanal. If you're willing to turn men into killing machines, if you're willing to abandon honor for efficiency, if you're willing to do whatever it takes to win, then eventually you arrive at atomic weapons. You arrive at the ability to kill hundreds of thousands of people in a single instant. The Marines at Guadalcanal killed 890 Japanese soldiers in one night and thought they'd become monsters. 3 years later, America killed that many people every second for 15 seconds over Hiroshima. But the men who fought at Guadalcanal never saw it that way. They saw themselves as doing what had to be done, surviving, going home to their families, making sure that if anyone died, it was the other guy. The efficient slaughter at the Tenaru River wasn't a moral failing in their minds. It was a tactical necessity. You either killed the enemy more efficiently than he killed you, or you died. Simple as that. War had stripped away all the complicated moral philosophy and left only that bare arithmetic. Kill or be killed. Win or lose. Survive or die. Private Sid Phillips summed it up in a letter to his father written a week after the battle. "We did terrible things here," he wrote. "Things I never thought I was capable of doing. Things that would horrify you if you knew the details. But we're alive, and they're dead, and that's the only mathematics that matters in war." His father never wrote back asking for those details. Some things were better left unsaid, better left buried in the jungle mud along with the 890 Japanese soldiers who'd learned too late that courage wasn't enough anymore. The lesson of Guadalcanal spread beyond just military tactics. It changed how America thought about warfare itself. Before Guadalcanal, there was still some romantic notion that war meant honorable combat between brave men fighting for their nations. After Guadalcanal, Americans understood that modern war meant efficient slaughter using industrial methods. It meant turning men into components of a killing machine. It meant abandoning any pretense of honor or glory and focusing exclusively on the brutal mathematics of casualties inflicted versus casualties sustained. That understanding shaped American military doctrine for the next 80 years. In Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, American forces always emphasized firepower and efficiency over individual courage. Always sought to maximize enemy casualties while minimizing their own. Always fought like a machine instead of like warriors seeking glory. The transformation that began at Guadalcanal became permanent doctrine, became the American way of war. Efficient, industrial, utterly without mercy when survival was at stake. The Japanese soldiers lying dead along the Tenaru River would have found that transformation incomprehensible. They died believing in Bushido, in honor, in the spiritual superiority of Japanese warriors over soft American civilians. They died never understanding that the Americans had simply decided that winning mattered more than honor, that going home alive mattered more than dying gloriously. That efficient killing beat courageous dying in every practical measure that mattered. And in the end, that's what cost Japan the war. Not lack of courage or devotion or fighting spirit, but the fundamental failure to understand that their enemy had abandoned honor for efficiency and would do absolutely anything to win.